expansion of previously troubled programs, and an explosion. Oh, my phone wants to talk to me. Or is that your phone? They're listening. Stay tuned for another hearing. For example, and $336 billion in loan authorities over the coming years from the Inflation Investment and Jobs Act and the IRA alone. Exponential funding increases, expansion of previously troubled programs, and an explosion of new ones certainly sound like a recipe for disaster. However, my Republican colleagues and I understand our constituents back home have sent us to Washington to protect their hard-earned American taxpayer dollars, and we intend to do just that. Today, we will hear from the heads of the agencies responsible for fighting fraud, waste, and abuse in federal programs. Our witnesses will help guide committee oversight efforts by highlighting important risk factors for mismanagement of federal funds and sharing lessons learned from their previous work. They will also share with us their upcoming plans for monitoring this massive spending tsunami. First, we welcome Inspector General Sean O'Donnell from the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of the Inspector General. Your office has noted that the EPA received, quote, the largest infrastructure appropriation in its history, end quote. So we are eager to hear more about challenges that accompany this rapid funding infusion. We are also joined by Inspector General Peggy Gustafson from the Department of Commerce's Office of the Inspector General. Last year, the CHIPS Act appropriated $50 billion for the Department of Commerce to spend on semiconductor programs. Additionally, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act charged the National Telecommunications and Information Administration with distributing $48 billion in broadband funding. We look forward to your insights on these programs and your plans for conducting oversight during the 118th Congress. We also appreciate the opportunity to hear from the Department of Energy's Inspector General Terry Donaldson. Over the past 2 years, the Department of Energy received billions of dollars across numerous offices to advance the Biden administration's clean energy agenda. The Department of Energy has boasted that it will stand up 60 new programs under the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act alone. We understand this presents an enormous challenge for your offices, and we are eager to hear your plans for protecting the real American taxpayer money from fraud, waste, and abuse in the various federal programs. Finally, we welcome Mr. Mark Gaffigan from the Government Accountability Office. GAO has provided countless recommendations to Congress and federal agencies to improve the efficacy of federal programs. This experience will be extremely helpful in guiding our discussions today. Again, this hearing is only one step of many to hold this administration accountable for its spending practices. I also hope this hearing will inform us in our efforts to collaborate with other inspectors general, and these productive conversations with our witnesses and their offices will continue. We all have a daunting task ahead, protecting real American taxpayer dollars, not monopoly money. I yield back. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor, for her 5-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I want to start by expressing my appreciation for the Inspectors General, the GAO, all that you do to ensure that our agencies are implementing federal laws effectively and that they are allocating federal funds responsibly. The IG and GAO responsibilities are essential, and they help inform our oversight work here in the Congress. We're here today to review the implementation of 3 historic laws championed by congressional Democrats and President Biden: the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, otherwise known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act. These laws make vital investments in improving the lives of our neighbors, bringing good-paying jobs to our communities, putting money back into people's pockets, and ensuring that we live up to our moral obligation to provide clean air, clean water, and a healthy planet for our children to inherit. Back home in Tampa and St. Pete, my neighbors and small businesses are already benefiting from the critical new investments to provide safer streets, clean up polluted Superfund sites, reconnect communities, spur needed housing, and train workers to take advantage of all of the new opportunities. And this is just the start. As a longtime member of this committee and the former chair of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, I am particularly proud of our work to address the escalating risks and costs driven by the climate crisis. We did a lot of great work to unleash American clean energy that is cheaper, to reduce pollution, and to ensure that it's American companies and American workers that are leading the way. These landmark achievements will make tangible progress on some of our greatest challenges. We should all be rooting for their success and the agency experts administering them. I regret that's not the tone from the majority. They have described these important programs as a frivolous spending spree, to which I remind everyone that the Inflation Reduction Act was paid for and actually will decrease the deficit by approximately $300 billion. Rather than helping our neighbors and all Americans benefit, some on the other side of the aisle seem to be hoping for the first minor misstep in order to declare these initiatives a failure. I understand that most of our Republican House colleagues voted against these landmark laws. By and large, they voted against capping the cost of insulin for Medicare beneficiaries. They voted against repairing crumbling roads and bridges and expanding broadband access to rural communities. They voted against initiatives that will make the U.S. more competitive and less dependent on Chinese and other foreign manufacturers. And Republicans voted against the oversight mechanisms that are built into these new laws, including additional funding for relevant offices of inspectors general. In fact, House Republicans are dedicating Congress's time this week to pass a bill that outright repeals major provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, provisions that save our neighbors back home money at a time that they really need it. The Polluters Over People Act would roll back key clean energy investments and pave the way for polluters to rake in profits at the expense of the health of the American people. Nevertheless, I hope we can have a productive discussion today. Oversight is very important to the success of these vital initiatives, and attention to the planning stages will ensure that these landmark laws deliver as we intended. So I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses and the work ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank Ranking Member Castor for her opening statement and now recognize the chair of the full committee, Ms. McMorris Rodgers, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Griffith. With every passing day, daily life gets more and more expensive for my constituents in Eastern Washington. They join people and families across the country who are paying skyrocketing prices to put gas in the tank, stock their shelves with food, house their families, and pay their energy bills. Inflation is spiraling out of control, thanks to President Biden's massive spending spree. It began with the American Rescue Plan and continued to escalate with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, creating helpful incentives for semiconductors or CHIPS and Science Act, and then the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. Most recently, the administration has doubled down on its reckless spending with its latest $6.8 trillion, yes, record-breaking $6.8 trillion budget proposed for fiscal year 2024. We've heard a lot about the so-called historic investments and the rush to green agenda that the administration plans to advance with hard-earned taxpayer dollars. We've had many questions surrounding this massive spending spree that is making life unaffordable in America. For example, how will agencies stand up dozens of new programs in a short period of time? Do program offices, especially brand new ones, possess the necessary expertise and oversight mechanisms to make responsible investments in new projects? How can American taxpayers learn more about how federal agencies are really spending their hard-earned tax money? How are conflicts of interest and political favoritism influencing agency funding decisions? How will agencies address long-standing problems with programs that will now have more funding to hand out? And how much of this money is being given to companies to build their products in China? My colleagues and I on the committee are pushing for answers to these questions. My constituents sent me to Congress to ask hard questions and to protect their hard-earned tax dollars. They're frustrated when looking at the federal government printing more and more money, doling out huge awards and incentives to preferred industries and favored political causes, all the while they struggle to make ends meet every day. However, I want to remind everyone at home and our federal agencies that my Republican colleagues and I are watching. We are ready to hold these agencies accountable and their leadership for their spending decisions. As Chair Griffith noted, our subcommittee chairs and I have already requested a full amount of account of the spending from our federal agencies and are going to continue to push for transparency. Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office are integral parts of the federal oversight community, and we appreciate all who are here today as witnesses to join us. We look forward to your testimony regarding the most serious challenges facing federal agencies, programs most vulnerable to waste, fraud, and abuse, and lessons learned from previous failures that Congress and agencies can apply to future mismanagement of taxpayer dollars. We also appreciate this opportunity to learn more about your upcoming work and difficulties you must confront in conducting oversight of these ballooning agency budgets. We plan to use the information we gathered today to prioritize our oversight efforts, pinpoint federal programs that demand more scrutiny, and identify how to stop wasteful spending. We have a lot of hard work ahead of us, given this unprecedented spending boost to many of the agencies under this committee's jurisdiction. However, we're not going to shy away from the challenge, and I do hope that we will do this together with my colleagues across the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, joining together for responsible stewardship of federal funds. As we are all duly elected members, representatives of the people, serving in the people's house, it is our Article I responsibility to conduct oversight so that the agencies within the federal government are responsive to those we serve. We cannot let the American people become irrelevant to a growing bureaucracy that recklessly prints and spends record amounts of money. Federal agencies must implement the law as it is written by Congress, the elected representatives of the people. Again, members on both sides of the aisle share a responsibility to monitor these activities, and I look forward to our discussion today. And again, thank you to the witnesses for being here. I yield back.
Thank Madam Chairman for yielding back. Now recognize Ms. DeGette, the Congresswoman from Colorado, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I'm subbing in today for the full committee ranking member who's on the floor on H.R. 1. And I'm glad that we have the opportunity to talk about these landmark bills that passed last Congress and the important work that the agencies are doing to implement them. In some of your testimony, Mr. Chairman, and some of the comments leading up to today's hearing, the word unprecedented was used to describe the scale of the programs and funding created through all these three programs, and I agree. These are unprecedented investments. And like Ms. Castor, I'm glad for that. These huge investments are necessary to take on the unprecedented challenges that our country faces, from climate change to healthcare costs to competition in global markets. Now, I know that the Democratic members in the Biden administration want to see these programs succeed because they're for the American people. And I also know that the agencies that are in charge of administering these programs take their obligations very seriously here. So far from a spending spree, these programs are generational investments, the opportunity to address deep inequities and the threats of unchecked climate change. The agencies know that they're not only the first line of attack against these issues, but also the first line of defense against waste, fraud, and abuse. So I don't want us to forget or to minimize the fact that there are people working hard at our federal agencies to ensure that every dollar from the legislation that we will discuss today is well spent. And the written testimony from all of the inspectors general here today focus very heavily on the risks of the program, and with good reason. These witnesses are appropriately focused on understanding the uphill climb that our federal agencies face in implementing these important programs. But I also want to make sure that what doesn't get lost in today's discussion is the risk of inaction. We cannot allow the risk of imperfection in these programs to paralyze them as bridges crumble, as manufacturing lines stall for want of microchips, as the climate becomes increasingly hostile for our children and our grandchildren. We have to face those risks, and we have to do what can be done to mitigate them. so that the programs developed and funded by the IRA, the IIJA, and the CHIPS and Science Act become true American success stories. We need to continue to work on this. And so I would argue the cost of obstructing the implementation of these laws is truly one that we cannot afford. Now, I know that the IGs and GAO have important roles in ensuring it's done correctly, and I look forward to hearing how we can work together to minimize risks while maximizing the rewards that these programs will bring to all Americans. And I will say, Mr. Chairman, I've been on this subcommittee my entire tenure in Congress, which is over 26 years. And this subcommittee has a storied history of having bipartisan oversight and investigation. And I will assure you, Mr. Chairman, the minority intends to make sure that there's no waste, fraud, or abuse in these programs, because every dollar that we spend that was appropriated in these three bills needs to go for the purpose for which it was designed. And that's where all of our wonderful witnesses and their agencies come in. It's why I'm very pleased that we had additional funding in these bills for oversight and for regulatory reform, because we need to make sure this money is well spent in the purpose that it's intended, and I think we can all get behind that in this committee. And with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. We now conclude with member opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. We want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today and taking the time to testify before this subcommittee. Each witness will have the opportunity to give an opening statement. Most of you have done this before, and we appreciate you doing it again, followed by a round of questions from the various members. Our witnesses today are the Honorable Sean O'Donnell, Inspector General for the Environmental Protection Agency, Honorable Peggy Gustafson, Inspector General for the Department of Commerce, the Honorable Terry Donaldson, Inspector for the Department of Energy, Mark Gaffigan, Managing Director at the Government Accountability Office. We appreciate you being here today, and I look forward to hearing from you on these important issues, and we will now swear you in. As you know, the testimony that you're about to give is subject to Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. When holding an investigative hearing, this committee has the practice of taking testimony under oath. Do any of you have an objection to taking testimony under oath? And let the record reflect that no one objected. Hearing no objections, will proceed. The chair advises you that under the rules of the House and the rules of the committee, you are entitled to be advised by legal counsel. Do you desire to be advised by counsel today during your testimony? And let the record reflect that all members responded that they did not desire to have legal counsel present with them at this time. Seeing none, if you will please rise and raise your right hand, and I will swear you in. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Again, seeing all witnesses answered in the affirmative, you are now sworn in and under oath, subject to the penalties previously referenced. With that, I will now recognize Sean O'Donnell for 5 minutes to give an opening statement.
Good afternoon, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and members of the subcommittee, and good afternoon, Chairwoman Rogers. I was supposed to be in Washington State visiting family this week, but I would not miss the opportunity to testify at this committee. But I should add, I will be in Seattle in time to see the Mariners opening day. I am Sean O'Donnell, the Inspector General for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Thank you for inviting me to testify about the importance of oversight of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. The IIJA's $60 billion represents the largest investment in the EPA's history, funding water infrastructure projects, electric school buses, and cleanup projects, as well as expanding the EPA workforce. This money is generally distributed through familiar mechanisms, like the state revolving funds or existing grant programs. However, we have serious capacity and capability concerns. One state recently shared with us its apprehension of receiving more SRF money now than in every previous year combined. This is because the SRFs are getting $40 billion from the IIJA and at least $6.5 billion from the American Rescue Plan Act. We've seen this before. The equation of an unprepared agency dispensing an unprecedented amount of money times the large number of struggling recipients equals a high risk of fraud, waste, and abuse. I'm grateful that Congress recognized the need for independent IIJA oversight and provided the OIG with funds for that purpose. Since enactment, we have leveraged every aspect of my office to identify high-risk programs and potential fraud vulnerabilities. We are using complex data analytics to identify where these funds are being spent and where potential fraud might happen. Because transparency is important to us, we've actually made a version of our data analytics available on our website for the public to view. Our oversight efforts have already produced results. Early on, we released a series of lesson learned reports which draw on our previous work, such as our American Recovery and Reinvestment Act work, to identify historical pitfalls that could endanger IIJA projects. Just last week, we released a report on outstanding recommendations related to internal controls necessary to effectively administer these IIJA programs. And this morning, we issued our inaugural Oversight Progress Report. We are now starting, or are preparing to start, at least a dozen audits and evaluations, covering everything from institutional controls at IIJA-funded cleanup projects to SRF capacity and management issues. We are also meeting with the EPA regularly to discuss its plans for creating and implementing new or expanded programs. More recently, we have focused on having grant provisions and policies related to fraud reporting, whistleblower protection, and OIG access put into place before the disbursement of funds. I expect we'll issue a report on this shortly. Finally, we are conducting targeted outreach to our stakeholders. Our investigators and auditors have held 168 joint IIJA fraud briefings, reaching more than 3,700 EPA staff, potential recipients, and other governmental officials. And we are working with other law enforcement and OIGs, including those here today, to share best practices for fraud prevention and investigation. The Inflation Reduction Act provides the EPA with another $41.5 billion for climate change, air quality, and environmental justice. In our estimation, this act carries even greater risks than the IIJA. As an example, the EPA formed the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights from a variety of programs already existing in the agency, and those programs had a combined budget of $12 million. The new office will now manage a grant portfolio of $3 billion, all of which must be distributed by 2026. We are concerned that the pace of IRA spending when conducted by new programs and received by new recipients significantly increases fraud vulnerabilities. These issues make clear that there is a significant need for strong independent oversight. Unfortunately, the IRA did not provide funds for EPA oversight. When combined with a dozen years of stagnant or declining appropriations and increasing demands for our work, we simply lack the capacity to conduct proper oversight of this $41.5 billion of EPA spending. But I can tell you this, we are prepared today to start working. Just like with the IIJA, we have a plan and we are ready to execute. We have already shown that with a modicum of funds, less than half a penny for every EPA dollar spent, we will show a return on your investment. The EPA supports the need for this kind of independent oversight, as does Congress, as is shown with the IIJA. I want to thank you for this. I want to thank you for the support that you have provided to the EPA OIG, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize Ms. Gustafson for her 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, Chairwoman Rogers, and members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for the invitation to appear today. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the Office of Inspector General's strong oversight of Department of Commerce programs and initiatives. Today, I'll share lessons we've learned about the oversight of emerging programs. I'll also provide an overview of Commerce OIG's independent oversight of several high-profile areas, including the CHIPS and Science Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, pandemic relief funds, and cybersecurity. The diverse mission and reach of the Department of Commerce often put Commerce OIG at the forefront of developing plans and tactics for effective oversight of emerging programs. I'd like to take a few minutes to highlight some of what we've learned over the past few years. OIG's audit work continues to identify vulnerabilities in how the department manages contracts and grants. We've identified challenges related to maintaining the acquisitions and grants workforce, improving processes to award and monitor contracts and grants, and mitigating the increased risk of fraud, waste, and abuse that additional funding brings. Our prior work in this area provides a foundation for understanding the challenges the department will face in administering the CHIPS Act and IIJA. Likewise, my office's work in auditing and evaluating the First Responders Network Authority, or FirstNet, is instructive for understanding the risks associated with reliance on a contractor and the need for the government to recruit staff with the technical skills related to these programs. We have issued numerous reports that demonstrate the department's need to maintain continuous, stringent oversight and independence to ensure the objectives of the programs are achieved. Our findings and recommendations serve as lessons for the administration of future programs of a complex and technical nature, such as the CHIPS Act programs. The CHIPS and Science Act affirms the need for increased domestic production of semiconductors and is a top oversight priority for my office. The Act provided Commerce OIG with $25 million over 5 years to conduct oversight. We're grateful for the funding, and we are hiring additional audit and investigative staff to provide rigorous oversight of CHIPS Act's programs and expenditures. Similarly, IIJA introduced new funding and challenges for the department. Again, our office received $18 million for oversight of IIJA broadband programs, and we've issued the first in a series of semi-annual reports summarizing broadband program status. The first of our IIJA-related audits is also underway. This is an audit of the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program to determine whether NTIA properly dispersed program funds and whether the funds are being used as intended. We also continue to provide oversight of the Department of Commerce's pandemic relief funds, which have increased the department's exposure to potential fraud. One of our top investigative priorities is to pursue fraud associated with the pandemic relief programs, and right now about 15% of our open investigations are pandemic related. Another area the office remains focused on is the department's continuing efforts to improve its cybersecurity posture. The risks associated with cybersecurity weaknesses can have wide-ranging impacts. A May 2021 executive order directed the government to move towards zero-trust cybersecurity principles. This presents a challenge because the department must make this move while simultaneously addressing longstanding cybersecurity weaknesses. Before closing, I'd like to say just a few words about our staff at the Department of Commerce OIG. We are confident in our ability to succeed in these critical oversight missions you have entrusted to us. In recent years, we've brought about a massive transformation, improving our audit processes, our HR functions, our information systems, and we've rebuilt our Office of Investigations. With these improvements, our recruiting is the best it's ever been. We attract highly skilled and experienced candidates, we hire them quickly, and we retain them. I'm proud of the work that this office does and the progress we've made. I'm extremely grateful for Congress's continued support of offices of Inspector General, and I look forward to the work ahead of us as we provide independent oversight to help the department meet its mission and support Congress in its legislative oversight roles. Again, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to taking your questions.
Thank you. And now recognize Ms. Donaldson for her 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today on the oversight risks associated with the Department of Energy's implementation of recent legislation. There are actually 4 pieces of recent legislation that have recently expanded the department's mission and budget exponentially, so I'll speak briefly about all 4 of those. The first is, of course, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which appropriated $62 billion to the Department of Energy. The Inflation Reduction Act, another $35 billion. The CHIPS Act, another $30.5 billion in authorizations. And the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023, moving $1 billion to the Puerto Rico Energy Resilience Fund. To put these numbers in perspective, the Department of Energy's fiscal year 2022 budget was $44.3 billion. So from approximately $44 billion, with the passage of these 4 acts, there is now $478 billion within the purview of the Department of Energy. And the department is moving swiftly to make these funds available. The department has already made nearly $45 billion available through funding opportunity announcements and has awarded or selected to negotiate another $13 billion. For fiscal year 24, the department is currently estimating a consolidated obligation under the new legislation to be approximately $30.4 billion. In the interest of time, I will discuss, since I have 5 minutes, 5 causes of risks, more general causes of risks. And these are the same causes that if you look back over the last 10 years in multiple federal programs, you'll see these same characteristics. They repeat themselves, unfortunately, over time. Number 1, implementing new programs. The chair mentioned the programs under IIJA. The grand total of new programs, when you roll in the IRA for the Department of Energy, is 71 brand-new programs. Number 2, fast-moving money. We've talked about that one already. Number 3, a large amount of money going to states, local governments, and tribes. Number 4, a lack of adequate funding for the department's oversight efforts. And number 5, a lack of adequate funding for my office. Back to number 1, we discussed the new programs. There are 71 of them. New programs raise immediate concerns such as acquiring and training expert staff and developing and, most importantly, testing your internal controls. I'm going to skip fast money since we've covered that. Item 3, when money moves in large quantities to states, local governments, and tribes. It is not yet clear whether these entities are equipped with sufficient staffing, are adequately trained, or have adequate control systems in place to protect these funds. Many of these entities suffered substantial fraud losses of the pandemic-related funds due to inadequate local oversight budgets. Next, the Department of Energy's oversight funding. Only a small amount of funding was included for administrative costs in the IIJA, arguably more flexibility in IRA. And the concern here is that administrative cost is a very large category that typically includes the bulk of the funds being used to move the money out. Oversight is a small amount of administrative costs. So if you start with a low number for administrative costs, what the number is for oversight will be substantially less than that. I turn now to item 5, which is the lack of funding for my office, the Office of the Inspector General. Prior to the passing of the 4 pieces of legislation, my office was already significantly underfunded. To further exacerbate the historic underfunding issue, my office received only $62 million under IIJA and only $20 million under IRA to oversee those programs for up to 10 years to come. We received nothing in the other 2 pieces of legislation. As a result, my office faces an immediate funding shortfall of over $300 million as even a first installment for my office to conduct appropriate oversight. So without additional funding, we will be stretched so thin that critical pre-existing areas will not receive appropriate OIG oversight. These areas include research security, grant fraud, environmental cleanup, and nuclear stockpile stewardship, to name just a few. I have been working with both Congress and OMB to correct my office's funding shortfall. The President's fiscal year 2024 budget includes $165.2 million for my office, which, if enacted, would leave a shortfall of $16.8 million in my base budget, but over $300 million in the budget that I would need to begin robust oversight efforts in connection with the new bills. The President has also issued a statement proposing an additional $150 in funding to assist under-resourced inspectors general, but has not yet announced the amount of this funding that might be allocated to my office, if the funds are authorized by Congress. I greatly appreciate these efforts to begin to address this problem, but more needs to be done. I turn now to the topic of the oversight efforts my office has already undertaken with respect to the recent legislation. We started by providing pertinent historic reports to the department, summarizing our own previous work in a series of 4 capstone reports. We have also initiated hundreds and hundreds of fraud awareness briefings. We meet regularly with the department 2 to 3 times a month and the implementation team in order to resolve as many issues as we can in advance. Thank you very much. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, and now turn to Mr. Gaffigan for his 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, members of the subcommittee. appreciate the opportunity to be here to discuss oversight of these three acts and GEO's views on that subject. First off, these three acts combined provide over $1.7 trillion in taxes and tax incentives and spending. And that's a significant amount. It includes important issues at Commerce, DOE, and EPA to address broadband, energy, water infrastructure. Collectively, between those three agencies is $300 billion. To put some of that in perspective, collectively, the annual budget for all three of those agencies is $150 billion. So this does present huge challenges for the agencies to effectively implement these programs, for Congress to conduct its oversight, and for the oversight community to assist in that. I want to talk about three things that GEO will try to do in helping with this oversight. First, talk about our overall oversight for these three acts. Second, talk about lessons we've learned from the Recovery Act and grants management in the past. And thirdly, talk about particular recs at these three agencies that are relevant to the funding that they're receiving under those three acts. First, in terms of GEO oversight, for IRA, we have 8 ongoing and 24 planned jobs looking at things like energy and Justice 40. For IIJA, we have 17 ongoing and 36 planned jobs looking at things including broadband, energy, and the environment. And under the CHIPS Act, we have an annual mandate to report every 2 years on the semiconductor work. And we'll continue to follow up on our recent work outlining the federal role in that area. Secondly, what broad lessons have we learned in the past looking at this type of funding? And I want to talk about 3 common themes that we'll try to bring to this oversight. One is the sort of striking the balance between streamlined systems to provide the grant funding, as well as at the same time having internal controls. And the danger here is either we're too involved or we're not involved enough. And finding that sweet spot is really important into getting these programs implemented in an effective way. And it requires looking at the characteristics of these programs in terms of how long the funding is. Is it a new program? Is it an existing program? So the answer is not always the same, but that's a challenge that we found in past work and we expect to find going forward. Secondly, a common theme is transparency and accessible data to assess where the money's going, to track the money and follow the money. That's been a problem in the past. We've had recommendations and matters to the Congress, for example, on usspending.gov. Still a lot of work to do in that area. Third, the third theme here is the need for collaboration and consultation. There are so many entities involved in addressing these problems at the federal, state, local, and tribal level, and outside of government, from the recipients and stakeholders. And so that consultation and that collaboration is really key to avoiding duplication, overlap, and fragmentation to make sure, again, that these funds are spent effectively. Lastly, I'll talk about the 3 agencies and work that we have ongoing in the past that's led to 29 recommendations that are still open that we think are relevant to the funding for these programs going forward. For example, at Commerce, we recently did 2 reports on broadband. One identified over 100 programs in the federal government, 15 different agencies, all addressing broadband, and the need for a national strategy to bring those agencies together to work effectively and collaborate on those programs. Secondly, at Commerce itself, looking at the NTIA, which is charged with implementing the broadband program, we identified a lack of performance measures, as well as an entity to take the lead on fraud risk assessment and to actually do that assessment. That's going to be key for that agency in carrying out its broadband program. At DOE, we've done some work on cost controls, so that'll be really important to the clean energy programs to ensure that we have an off-ramp when things aren't going well and avoid spending money when it shouldn't be spent. And lastly, at EPA, we have a history of doing grants work there. Typically, almost half their budget is through grants. They have a lot of experience in doing that, but we've made recommendations in the past about increasing their expertise and the workforce capacity. And with this huge increase, we want to relook at those and make sure that the recommendations we made in the past are still going strong. So That sums up our statement, and I look forward to working with you and our colleagues in the oversight community to exercise oversight over these important programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gaffigan. Thank you all for your testimony. We will now move into the question and answer portion of the hearing. I will begin questioning by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. So, Mr. Gaffigan, I didn't hear you say you needed more staff to handle all this money. Some of the others said that. Is that something that you also would need as a result of these 3 and 4 large new spending items?
That would be very helpful. We did receive $25 million under the IIJA and $5 million under IRA, or one or the other. That'll help some, but we need auditors. Sir, when I started here in 1987, we had 5,100 FTEs. It went all the way down to 3,000. Congress has been very supportive in getting us back. We're hoping to get to 3,500 FTEs this year, but we really need analysts to cover the things, because since 1987, the work has not gotten easier and the programs have not gotten smaller.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Ms. Donaldson, you indicated that you had a $300 million shortfall, and the way I heard that, and you correct me if I'm wrong, what I heard was that that's $300 million even if we adopted the president's budget with an extra 165 for your agency and 150 million spread across all the IG agencies. Did I understand that correctly? Mike? Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, we would back out of that number, whatever amount of the 150 million might become available to my shop. That number, though, of 300 million does not include the loan portfolio, which is a huge portfolio, which is why I characterize it as the first installment
Right.
of what we will really need in the end.
And going forward, what you're saying is you think that Congress should put ample amounts for Inspector General's offices into any significant spending increase. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
All
Well
right.
said.
Now, you brought up the loan program, and I've been keeping an eye on the DOE's loan program for years. With all this new money, has your office had any discussions with DOE leadership about, since this report and all has come out, regarding the major risk areas that your office has identified?
We have. We meet 2 or 3 times a month, and the Loan Program Office has actually made 2 presentations to the Office of General Counsel staff. We're not allowed to consult or advise. That would impinge upon our independence, but we do ask a lot of questions. So, and they've already been in the queue twice with us.
I hope as you're asking those questions, you'll ask if they have safeguards to make sure that we don't end up with another Solyndra problem, because in that case, they didn't follow the off-ramp that Mr. Gaffigan, there was one built into the code, and DOE didn't follow the off-ramp, and as a result, it cost the taxpayers additional money. I understand there's always a risk when you do a new program, but in this case, as you'll recall, they defaulted in December of 10 and didn't bankrupt until after we'd given them some, I want to say 110 million more, it might have been 125, but somewhere in that neighborhood, million more money. So are you not advising, but asking them if they're prepared to make sure that if they get something bad, that they cut their losses as quickly as possible?
Yes, that issue has come up, Mr. Chairman.
I'm glad it has. I'm particularly concerned about your office's finding in the special report that actions by the Loan Program Office officials potentially violated standards of ethical conduct and could call into question the office's integrity. Do you know about what I'm talking about? This is the, this is a question I've got here that deals with what we asked for Secretary Granholm, seeking more information about what DOE has done to address its loan program risk factors as identified in the June 2022 DOE Office of Inspector General Special Report. That's the report I'm referring to.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. That report was a capstone report, so we pulled from previous work, some of which was even accomplished during the Solyndra era. That report was not a comment on the current loan program office. They are staffing up, working very hard, hiring outside consultants. They are rebuilding that office.
So they are dealing with what you all identified previously as some potential ethical problems.
Correct, Mr. Chairman.
All right, I appreciate this. And I assume you're going to continue to monitor all of this
Yes.
as you move forward.
Yes, sir.
All right, I appreciate that too. data collection monitoring project to collect and analyze oversight information from 5 DOE programs. I'm pleased to see that you all are doing that, including that loan program, because I have been very concerned about that. Okay? I do appreciate your time here this morning, or this afternoon, and I will now yield back and recognize Ranking Member Castor for her 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all again for being here. It is vitally important that we ensure that these very significant investments actually deliver for the American people, and you all are key to doing that. That's why we included in these new laws funding increases for the IGs, criteria to maintain program integrity, and GAO studies to inform policy. I heard a couple of different scenarios from you. Ms. Gustafson said you're confident in your abilities now, recruiting is the best it's been, but Ms. Donaldson kind of painted a different picture. I hear you loud and clear. Mr. O'Donnell, how about your shop?
Thank you for asking. We were fortunate to receive support. Thank you. We were fortunate enough to receive support under the IIJA, and as I said, we moved out immediately. We've hired auditors, evaluators. Our evaluators tend to be technical and investigators. But we have been suffering for more than a decade under flat or declining budgets. And if I can put it into real terms, terms that I think are a little stark, is 12 years ago, we were funded for 365 full-time equivalents, and now we're down to 270. This is our base budget. What I've talked about today is getting funds for coverage of the IRA. And I think that the proposal that we've talked about is a modicum of support, taking part of what was given less than half a penny to the agency to help fund us to ramp up oversight. And I know the agency has supported us in this proposal as well.
So that's, we hear a similar song from the EPA Administrator, Michael Regan, about hiring at the Environmental Protection Agency. So let the call go out to talented young people across this country right now. Your country needs you to help tackle these problems, tackle the climate crisis, unleash American clean energy, rebuild our roads and bridges, our water systems. So I hope, I say this because there are young people in the audience today, and I hope they will help spread the word. There are enormous opportunities to serve your country in this way. Mr. O'Donnell, you highlighted right off the bat, you are concerned about the Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund. Very significant investments in cleaning up waterways and water systems across the country. Coming from the state of Florida, you know, the list is so long of projects that we need to protect water everywhere, to update wastewater systems and water systems. So it concerns me that you're highlighting that right off the bat as an area of concern. I'm concerned that the state of Florida doesn't have the cops on the beat at the state level. Meanwhile, our local communities are ready, willing, and able with their engineering partners to get to work on this. What else do we need to know about the Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund and your interactions with the agency and what else you're going to be doing there?
Thank you for asking, and we share your concern. For the first time in 15 years, we're starting to review the financial statements of the state revolving funds to ensure that they are healthy. We're also looking at how they're handling things like single audits of their recipients and their subrecipients. And I have actually made a concerted effort to go out to the different states to meet with the administrators of the SRFs, to hear from them.
Have you been to Florida?
I have. I went to Florida in December. Unfortunately, we were not able to. We tried. We were not able to meet. But it is my plan to go to Florida, particularly before it gets too hot, and to meet there and have that same conversation. And that conversation is exactly along the lines of what you said, which is we want the states to know that we are their partners in helping to make sure that these funds are executed appropriately, and we're their partners in fighting fraud. We have trained investigators who are ready, willing, and able to look at water infrastructure and crimes that are committed in the construction or the operation of the water infrastructure.
Yeah, our economy is based on clean water and clean beaches, so I'll be very interested in following up with you on that. So over at the Department of Energy, are there any, what is piquing your interest right off the bat? What do you want to highlight as a concern? I hear what you say on the oversight of the loan program, but what else?
I would say it's the combination of so many new programs and the fast money. Some of the risks that I talked about actually all exist cumulatively, so that gives me great concern. I would like to see the department move forward with a more robust use of data analytics. I think that would be a tremendous tool for them. They are working on that now. But there are so many new things happening over there, it would be hard to really rank them at this moment in terms of program-specific risks.
Are you able to have, well, I see I'm over my time. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Ms. Kathy McMorris-Rogers, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate you all being here. I wanted to start with one program, one of many, but the EPA's Clean Bus Program. I recently visited some propane suppliers in Spokane who were quite concerned about the way that this program is being implemented. It's a program, at least as it was described to me, 50% was to go for electrification of school buses, 50% for propane, or alternative. And the way it's being implemented, 100% is being reimbursed if it's a electric school bus, costing $370,000 each, versus the alternatives that EPA has decided to reimburse a third of that cost if it's an alternative. So for propane, a bus would cost $107,000. EPA will reimburse a third of that. If it's an electric, costing $370,000, we'll pay the whole thing. I just wanted to ask about this program in particular, if you would elaborate on just the implementation, if they plan to modify the program, given the supply limitations, and according to the 2022 rebate, winners have already been announced. What challenges does EPA and EPA OIG face in monitoring these funds after winners have been announced?
Thank you for the question, and we share your concern with respect to the Queen School Bus. We announced a project recently, an audit of how the agency is handling supply chain issues and decision-making issues with respect to the Queen School Buses. Early indications are that the capacity of the United States to produce enough clean school buses, electric school buses, along the lines of what the agency envisions is not possible. That these funds would not be executed in time to actually meet the goals of the program. We have concerns that go beyond this, too. It is one thing to give a school district an electric bus. It is another thing then for them to recharge that electric bus. And at this point, we're concerned that there isn't the infrastructure for them to recharge these electric
Okay,
buses.
so what would happen to, what will happen to the money if they can't spend it?
This touches on a continuing recommendation that we make with the agency, which is monitoring funds that are obligated but not spent, and having the agency appropriately deobligate those funds. I cannot remember, and I will get
I'll
back to you.
follow up later. Okay, thank you. Ms. Donaldson, Department of Energy, we had sent, Chairs Griffith, Duncan, and I had sent a letter to DOE asking for some accounting of some funds and major spending laws, some of which we've discussed today, and I was disappointed with the response. Probably shouldn't be surprised, but it was incomplete. We got it last night, but it's a pattern over the last 2 years. The department has not been cooperating with us. For me, it's unacceptable. And one of the things they pointed to was usaspending.gov, that's where I should go to get the spending, I guess, of Department of Energy. You mentioned data analytics that they're developing. Would you speak to the timeline of these data analytics and
They have not described a timeline. I think they are, and I don't mean to speak for them, they would be the better witness to answer this question. I don't know that they have sufficient funding or staff dedicated to this mission yet. I think they recognize the power of the tool, but they are in early days in terms of designing an effective data analytics program.
Okay, thank you. Well, and I was in Congress when the Recovery Act was passed, the ARRA, and I remember they set up this whole website, and they had congressional districts that didn't exist that were getting funded, you know, and we're talking, I don't know how many times the money now, 7, 8 times the money. To Mr. Gaffigan, I wanted to ask about data analytics and just how are we doing as far as internal controls to be able to have any kind of tracking of these dollars?
Yeah, I mentioned as one of the themes of that past work, because I also helped audit the ARRA funds, and there was great hope for the setting up of these data sources and a way to analyze it, but it's fallen short. And just the quality of the data, as you alluded to, has not been well done. And we've had some recommendations to OMB and Treasury to try to work on that, and also matters to Congress to try and improve that situation.
Well, would you speak to what you believe can be done, either at an agency level or federal government-wide, to increase some kind of accountability?
Well, we talked about clarifying OMB and Treasury's responsibilities. We have also recently testified 10 different matters for Congress to try and improve federal spending information, and it included having the IGs do some of the checking of these reports.
Okay. I have a lot more questions, but my time has expired. I'll yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Now recognize former chair of this subcommittee, Diana DeGette, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I was pleased to see that as part of these bills, there was an increase in funding for Inspector General's offices for the most part, and to do this work, because I think it's important work. Ms. Donaldson, I was dismayed to hear that you did not receive the funding that you need to do your job, and I was pleased to hear that at least some of that funding is included in President Biden's budget this year. So I'm sure all of my Republican colleagues will be supporting these provisions of the president's budget because they are so concerned about oversight, and I will make sure that I remind them of that when we do the appropriations bills, because you do have to, you can't just wave a magic wand and do oversight. So I appreciate that. Right before I came over today, I was speaking, I'm a member of a group called the House Democracy Partnership, and we work a lot with legislators around the world, and I speak to them quite frequently about the importance of oversight over government spending. So I said I was coming over to an oversight hearing, and they said, oh, what's the topic of the hearing? And I had to really think, because the topic of the hearing is, quote, follow the money, oversight of President Biden's massive spending spree. And it's a little embarrassing for someone like me who's trying to tell colleagues around the world that we need to have robust oversight, that the U.S. Congress is actually having an oversight hearing that is so vague that you can't possibly see what we're going to do, especially since we're bringing in inspectors general from 3 important agencies, and especially since the programs are only now just being implemented. So the first thing I want to say is kudos to the 3 of you for thinking ahead about the protocols we're going to put in place to make sure that these funds are spent wisely and the way they were intended. Secondly, thank you for giving detailed written statement, even though this was a very vague topic of this hearing. And thirdly, thank you for your very persuasive, albeit limited, verbal testimony today about your intentions. I just want to ask each one of you one question, and in the John Dingell tradition, it can be answered with a yes or no. And the question is, does your agency intend to oversee the implementation of the provisions of this legislation that you oversee with full and robust efforts? Yes or no? Mr. O'Donnell?
Do you mean my office or the EPA?
EPA and your office.
My office, yes.
Ms. Gustafson?
Commerce OIG, yes.
Ms. Donaldson.
Yes, ma'am.
So, good news, they're all going to do their best to oversee it. I would suggest, Madam Chair, that we actually have hearings directed at specific programs. I think that'll be a much better use of this committee's time, and with that, I yield back.
And the chair calls on Mr. Burgess for 5 minutes of questions.
I thank the chair. Look, I don't mean it to be like this, but it's going to sound like I'm overly critical and you all are not the problem. But, oh my God, you have described an absolutely staggering, astonishing volume of dollars, which the country didn't have and had to borrow from China to pay for these things. And now you need more money to make sure that the people in the agencies don't rob the taxpayer of further dollars. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's like a Franz Kafka novel. So, being a student of Willie Sutton, you remember the guy that robbed the banks, and they asked him why he robbed the banks. He said, that's where the money is. You guys have the money. I mean, I didn't really do a running tally of the amounts, but would you all agree that that is a staggering amount of money that is aggregated in what we are talking about today? I mean, I can't remember ever having had a hearing about that number of dollars, and yet you're telling us, to a person, you can't manage to make sure that these funds are properly expended unless you get more money. And, you know, I'm sorry for people watching this, if anyone is, I hope they are, they probably aren't, but for anyone watching this, they're not going to understand. You could not run a business that way. You could not just go into debt indefinitely. Your share value would be zero by the end of the day, and you'd be as broke as cryptocurrency. So, again, this is going to sound critical. I don't mean for it to, but am I correct in the statement that this staggering amount of money that we're talking about today is likely money that had to be borrowed from somewhere? Mr. O'Donnell, I'll start with you.
That's not my expertise, but I wanted to just make one point here with respect to the funding for my agency and for the others, is independent audit, whether it's a corporation or the government, is an essential function of that sort of three lines of defense and making sure that money is spent well and in compliance. And what we're saying here today is not to give us new money, but to actually use the money that's already been given to pay for that independent audit so we can make sure that third line of defense is there.
Sure, that was part of the CFO Act from the 1990s in the George Herbert Walker Bush administration when they were trying to get control over this. But unfortunately, every dollar that we're talking about is going to be borrowed. And what has happened to the interest rate in the 2.5 years of the Biden administration? It's gone through the roof. So, you know, I apologize if I sound, and I'm not frustrated with you, but having spent part of the morning in a budget hearing and seeing all the charts and graphs that literally go off the top, I don't see how it's sustainable what the Democrats have put us into. Mr. O'Donnell, let me just ask you too, because I think I saw in your written statement the comment that these funds will remain available until expended. Is that correct?
For the IIJA, that is. For most of those, that's true, though, and I believe if you look at them in terms of the state revolving funds, those funds will revolve back, and so they will, in some sense, perpetuate.
Yes, perpetuate, thank you. That is the word I was looking for, and I couldn't find. So all of the dollars that you are talking about also are compounded by the fact that interest will have to be paid on those dollars. And again, as we heard this morning in another budget hearing, we are very quickly on the road where we're going to be spending more money, mandatory spending, on the interest payments than we spend on defense of the United States, which again is an untenable situation in a very dangerous world. Mr. Gafkin, let me just ask you this, because my office is on the west side of this building, and I look out over the expanse of the Hubert Humphrey building. And for the last 3 years, I swear there has not been a soul in that building. Is it expensive to maintain a federal building that is not occupied?
there's a lot of work on sort of real property and trying to minimize footprints, and I know with the pandemic, that's created a whole new set of questions for agencies in terms of whether they need to reduce their footprint.
I would say it's been pretty effectively reduced for the last 3 years. There's a little daycare center that I can see from my window, and there hasn't been a child playing in the daycare center since March of 2020. It's an expensive proposition, and it's one that really at some point we're going to have to get our hands around. Ms. Donaldson, this committee came to fame with the investigations over the Solyndra funding, with which you are very familiar. What do you think about the DOE Loan Authority? Is that going to continue to be a risky program where there's the continued risk for dollars going where they weren't supposed to?
I think they're staffing up and working very hard right now, and the future will tell. I actually wasn't the Inspector General during Solyndra, so I've reviewed the reports, and you know a lot more about Solyndra than I do, I would hazard a guess.
Yeah, Mr. Griffith rose to fame on those investigations. Look, these are serious problems, and I don't mean to make light of them. I do appreciate your efforts because I think they're extremely important. It's just extremely frustrating to me that someone talked about the next generation of Americans. We have burdened them with an untenable amount of debt, and unfortunately, they're the ones who are going to have to pay it. I thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you. The chair calls on Ms. Chakowski for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you so much. For decades, companies have outsourced the manufacturing of, is that right? Oh, sorry. Let's start over. I've got time. So for decades, companies have outsourced the manufacturing of advanced semiconductors. And these chips are needed to produce what we need to manufacture here in the United States, which is, of course, our big goal right now, to make sure that we have the supply chain. The CHIPS and Science Act will, what is this? Oh, okay, anyway, the CHIPS and Science Act is exactly what I think that we need. And in fact, in my state of Illinois, just yesterday, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker announced a new initiative called Innovate Illinois. And this public-private partnership will bring together stakeholders in the state legislature and in business and maximize the impact of federal fundings that is coming. And so I wanted to ask Ms. Gustafson. No, is that right? I say it right? Good, okay. I know that as the CHIPS Act is being implemented, that your office is going to play a vital role in making sure that we oversee how it evolves. And so my question to you is, how are you preparing the Commerce Office of Inspector General, all the staff, to be able to perform the oversight that we need, the efficiency that we need, and make sure that it really works?
Thank you for that question. As I mentioned in my opening statement, my office is extraordinarily, very grateful that we did receive dedicated funding for oversight of the CHIPS and Science Act. We received $25 million over 5 years. So what we are able to do and what we are in the midst of doing is hiring new folks with technical expertise, because I think one of the biggest challenges for something like the CHIPS Act is that it's an extremely technical activity, building semiconductor chips that maybe the government, most parts of the government don't have the technical expertise in. So one of the things that we have undertaken, that we have emphasized as well to the department, is that it's important that the department understand as the bids start coming in, not the bids, apologies, as the requests for the funding start coming in, it's really important that the Department of Commerce and the Office of Inspector General have the technical expertise to oversee these programs. So we are staffing up in that arena. We are also CHIPS, of course, is very new. The notice of funding opportunity was just released at the end of last month. The applications are not yet in. It's expected to be an iterative process, but just like Ms. Donaldson had mentioned, we are in constant communication with the department, hearing what they are doing, being kept abreast of their activities, and emphasizing to them their important role in overseeing this program, and how there's a lot of us out there looking for oversight staff right now, including the departments. And so,
Oh, I'm sure. Let me just ask you this. What are some of the best practices that the Department of Commerce could do to make sure that they communicate with prospective grant recipients and do it in the best way?
So I think the key on that one is exactly to your point, is communication, is outreach, because it is a brand new, CHIPS is brand new. So I think the best practices are practices that, can be taken from things, frankly, like ARA or the pandemic relief, where there was communication being undertaken by the departmental stakeholders about what the program is, what the requirements are. I can't sit here and tell you how well they're doing because we haven't done a review of it, but I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned in the government. CHIPS is kind of the newest act of all the ones that we're talking about, so I think it's important that the department be learning from what has already been undertaken in the last several years.
Thank you so much. Let me just say that unfortunately, most of our Republican colleagues voted against the CHIPS and Science Act. I hope that we're going to be able to work together to make sure that this program is done well and that it actually does improve commerce and competitiveness in the United States. And I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding back. Now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr.
Thank
Guthrie, for
you.
his
Thank
5
you,
minutes.
Mr. Chair. I appreciate the recognition, and I want to, and this first is for Ms. Gustafson. Your written testimony notes that the CHIPS and Science Act provides the Department of Commerce with up to $39 billion in direct funding for semiconductor activities, $11 billion for semiconductor research and development, and up to $75 billion in direct loans and loan guarantees. Your testimony also states that the Department of Strategic Goals for implementation of this act include investment in U.S. production of strategically important semiconductor chips. Like many of my colleagues, I am concerned that this taxpayer funding can wind up funding production of semiconductors in China or enriching our global adversaries, or also joint ventures with China here in the United States. Based on your experience, what challenges does the Department, my question, based on your experience, what challenges does the Department of Commerce face in administering this funding to retain its benefits domestically? And what role, if any, will your office have in making sure these funds don't get to China, either production in China or joint ventures here with China?
Thank you for your question. I think that the key, the biggest challenge and the biggest piece of advice I would give the Department of Commerce as it relates to this is that it's one thing to have a program that makes it very clear that there are restrictions on what the recipients of this program, the business that they can be involved in. And to your point, the key is going to be enforcement and whether the department is taking that role seriously. And to that end, I would note that the statute takes great pains, and I don't mean that in a painful way, I mean has made it very clear that there are guardrails in place to protect against some of that. What is going to be incumbent, and I think that what is crucial but is too early to tell, is whether that oversight at the department level happens and whether the actions that are provided to the Secretary of Commerce for taking action in those instances, whether those happen. And I would note, I'm sure you're aware of this, that we would be looking at this anyway, but certainly with the statutory mandate for the Department of Commerce Inspector General very specifically says that Congress wants to know about that and within a certain amount of time. So we are certainly absolutely going to do that. So.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. So, Ms. Donaldson, according to the Department of Energy's website, the new Grid Deployment Office will be responsible for implementing many of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and Inflation Reduction Act grid resilience and reliability programs. Do you have any concerns about how this new office will handle programs addressing such an important issue and involving so much money so soon after its creation? And have you been part of any conversations with the Department of Energy leadership regarding how this office will coordinate with and avoid duplication with other offices with such a mission such as Office of Electricity, Office of Cybersecurity, and so forth?
Yes, we have had a conversation covering aspects of the grid deployment office. It's, again, been one of those subjects that we've teed up during our meetings every 2 to 3 weeks. We don't have a lot of information in yet about the grid deployment office. We have an outstanding monitoring project data acquisition, so that information is now coming in. So it would be too early for me to have much of an opinion on how it is going over there.
Thank you. And Mr. Gaffigan, has the Government Accountability Office reviewed or otherwise been involved in the Department of Energy's reorganizations? And what general concerns or pitfalls should Congress be aware of accompanying agency reorganizations?
We haven't had any recent work on DOE reorganizations. Probably the last questions we got were when NNSA broke off from defense programs, but that's been a while ago. But there are some lessons learned in terms of reorganizations that we've developed some criteria around which would apply to any agency reorganization if we were asked to do so.
Okay, thank you. And back, Ms. Gustafson, I'm sorry, I apologize. Is there, you said guardrails on making sure the investment doesn't go to China? Because the idea is that we're going to bring this technology here and not in China. But is there any guardrails on preventing joint ventures from American companies to do joint ventures on domestic soil with China? So China has our technology?
I would have to get back to you on whether the statute gets to that. Honestly, I don't know, but I'm happy to get that answer back to you, sorry.
Okay, that would be helpful. Thank you. I will yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Mr. Tonko for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's clear our country is is called upon to meet the challenges of an innovation economy, to win a global race in that innovation economy. And I hope we all respond by embracing a spirit of can-do. That's including adequate resources and staffing levels at key agencies to make this happen. Failure is not an option here. So let me just go into the water infrastructure area. It's unacceptable that so many Americans lack access to safe drinking water. The water system is plagued by frequent main breaks, massive leaks of treated water, PFAS contaminations, and an estimated 10 million lead pipes in service, which are overwhelmingly found in low-income communities and communities of color. As past chair and now ranking member of the Environment Subcommittee, ensuring that all Americans have easy access to safe drinking water has been a long-time priority. As a result of decades of inaction to replace aging lead pipes, millions of American families and children have been exposed to lead contamination water. We've even reduced staffing at some of these agencies to a really dangerous level. With passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the federal government is finally investing in our water systems and lead service line replacement, which will have an enormous impact on families' health and well-being. Specifically, the IIJA provides $43 billion in state revolving funds to improve water infrastructure grants in communities across our country. These investments in clean water are essential, and we need to make certain they are implemented effectively. So I know what the EPA agrees, that the EPA agrees with that, and they are working hard to ensure that every dollar counts and to get the staffing where it should be. IGs can play a significant role in protecting important government programs like the state revolving funds. So, Mr. O'Donnell, in your testimony, you mentioned that your office has reviewed EPA's prior responses to water emergencies and that you are focused on oversight of the state revolving funds. Based on your office's ongoing work in this area, how should the EPA make certain that the state revolving funds are reaching the areas of highest need while hopefully preventing future water emergencies?
Thank you. One of the first projects that we announced, the first audits we announced, is looking at how the agency is identifying those communities in need for lead service line replacement. Because it was our sense from previous water emergencies that the agency does not have a great sense of where those lead service lines are and where those lines need to be replaced. And I agree with you on the need for the robust oversight of the water system. We have ongoing right now 3 reviews that touch on the failures of water system. We have 2 projects involving Jackson, Mississippi. In fact, I just met with Representative Thompson this morning to discuss our oversight of the Jackson water crisis. We have one in Red Hill with the Honolulu water system and one in St. Charles, Missouri for their water system. We intend to fully become more robust partners in oversighting those state revolving funds so they do exactly, sir, what you want them to do.
Well, it's been long overdue. So, Mr. Gaffigan, in your written testimony, you highlighted some past recommendations the GAO has made to EPA to improve its monitoring of grants and ability to track the financial sustainability of the SRF. As you noted, EPA has implemented many of these GAO recommendations. How will those improvements help EPA better manage the clean water and drinking water state revolving funds?
I think it'll help them very much. I think they've been pretty responsive to our recommendations in the past. They have, for example, I think one sort of outstanding recommendation around financial indicators, but it allows them to have a better sense of the sustainability of these funds by implementing these recs. And I'll also mention that we have some ongoing work looking at the formula for some of these funds, which hasn't been looked at in a long time.
And what else does EPA need to do to ensure that this increased investment has the greatest impact on the communities that need it the most?
I think their commitment to the workforce in terms of having good workforce to handle this huge increase will really lead to some benefits, and also being able to weigh, because now they have the option to address both lead in drinking water and the PFAS. They were specifically called out in the legislation, so I think that'll help them with their criteria in terms of determining where the biggest needs are.
Okay, well, we'll all be watching and doing what we can to ensure that our agencies have the support and guidance they need to effectively carry out their missions. Americans deserve the benefits that these programs have to offer, and we in Congress will move to make certain they succeed. We cannot fail in this innovation race. I want to see a good, robust, can-do attitude and spirit. Make it happen. Let's work together and let's get it done. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, for her 5 minutes of questioning, and recognize the Vice Chairman of this sub.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to applaud all of you for your hard work and for your office's hard work. Very vital. Ms. Donaldson, your March 13th, 2023 report stated that the DOE Office of Science failed to adequately audit at least $56 million in grants. You wrote that the DOE Office of Grants and Cooperative Agreements within the Office of Science told your office that because of contract specialists' high workloads, they focus on issuing awards and do not have adequate resources to verify where the grantee is compliant with audit requirements. I understand that to mean that the DOE focuses on getting money out the door and not on whether recipients are complying with oversight requirements. Ms. Donaldson, is that a fair interpretation?
Well, I'll say this about the volume of anything that gets audited, be it a grant, cooperative agreements.
Can you pull your mic closer?
Oh, I sure can, thank you. Yeah, my comment about what volume of dollars get audited is there is no federal agency that's ever at 100%. So and it wouldn't be efficient to be at 100%. So what that report was about is looking at whether or not in a particular area, the percentage was high enough, to be protecting the resource. In the opinion of my audit team, it was not.
Thank you. Ms. Donaldson, how can the DOE adequately audit billions of dollars of new money if they weren't able to adequately audit millions?
I think there is the two big problems that I alluded to earlier. There has to be an adequate reservation of oversight dollars because the Department of Energy also conducts audits. I don't conduct 100% of the audits. So they are the front line of defense. So they need adequate resources. And then, of course, the Office of the Inspector General needs adequate resources. And you will never achieve 100%, but you want to achieve in any particular program a high enough number to where you have some confidence that those funds are safe.
Ms. Donaldson, thank you. Do you have an estimate in how much taxpayer money may be lost to fraud, waste, and abuse because of the agency's lack of proper oversight?
That's an interesting question. I think that might require a bit of a crystal ball. I will comment on the general topic of oversight dollars and recovering money. So I always say that oversight dollars usually make money, don't lose money. So for example, the work of the offices of inspectors general, much of what we do can't be monetized. We put people in jail, there's deterrence, we correct standards. A lot of what we do you can't put a number on. When we do put a number on things that we can put a number on, most offices of inspector general recover more money than we cost. So we are not a cost center, we're the opposite of that. So oversight dollars well spent can reduce that level of fraud, waste, and abuse. So I think it's very important to think of oversight dollars in that way. Not money wasted, money recovered.
Understood. Last question. If a longstanding program office, such as the Office of Science, cannot manage the oversight of its financial assistance awards and absorb new funding, how can taxpayers trust new offices to administer their grants appropriately?
That's another tough one. I think you have to look at those same issues. There has to be the resources, that level of audit, inspector general audits coming behind it. All of those things have to happen so that you have some assurance that those funds are going where Congress intended them to go.
Well, let's hope that we get proper oversight and that we give the oversight offices enough money to do their jobs, because I am very concerned that if we can't do proper oversight on millions of dollars, how are we going to do it on billions of dollars of all these new programs? And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Dr. Ruiz, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Griffith. Our nation faces numerous challenges, whether it be climate change, the ongoing drought in the West, or our nation's crumbling infrastructure. In the last 2 years, Congress faced these challenges head-on with bold investments like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. I supported these bills because my district has suffered from underinvestment for years, and I am focused on bringing federal resources to promote equity and help those in most need. Today, I want to focus on one particular way that we delivered for the American people last Congress, and that's through broadband. There are tremendous disparities across the country when it comes to broadband access. In my district alone, in Imperial County, one of the most impoverished, under-resourced counties in the state of California, 15% of households go without broadband internet subscription. According to the FCC, about 21% of people living on tribal lands and 17% of people living in rural areas lack access to broadband. The bipartisan infrastructure bill provided $65 billion to ensure that every American has high-speed internet. $48 billion of this funding is dedicated to closing the digital divide by bringing affordable and reliable high-speed internet to underserved communities. This includes the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, which received $2 billion in additional funding. From the 23 projects funded in 2022 from this program, more than 40,000 Native American households will be connected to the internet, and over 1,000 new jobs will be created in 15 states. Ms. Gustafson, as you shared in your written testimony, your office is creating specialized broadband audit teams. You've also begun an audit of the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program and have started issuing semi-annual reports summarizing the status of bipartisan infrastructure law programs. Will your office's oversight activities evaluate whether these funds under the bipartisan infrastructure law are distributed equitably and are reaching historically underserved communities?
Thank you for your question. Our oversight is going to be directed in several ways, in several areas, as you can imagine. One of the first concerns, since there have been, and it's been mentioned previously, there have been broadband programs before, obviously, in the federal government, including at Commerce when under the Recovery Act, there was the BTOP program. So we are going to be focused, first off, on making sure that the program is doing what is intended, to your point. So is it going to, because if the main point is to serve the underserved communities, which it is, we have concerns about duplication of effort where it's already been done. So that's one of the first things that, you know, we're making sure that this is truly not going to places where there is already broadband, and whether it's achieving, and whether it's achieving its purpose. And
in order so that you can get your focus on areas that don't have broadband.
Right. To your point, many of these programs are very specifically designed for that, so that our oversight will be directed to that as well.
Mr. Gaffigan, you mentioned in your testimony that the GAO issued a report in January with recommendation to approve program performance measurement and that the National Telecommunications and Information Administration concurred with those recommendations. How might adoption of these recommendations enhance the impact of NTIA's expansion of broadband access to tribal lands and other communities that lack access to high-speed internet?
I think it'll help in two ways. One, it'll sort of ensure that the fraud risk framework is established and so that the monies go to where they need to go. And also, it'll talk about if they implement our recommendations around performance measures so we can see we're getting value for money here. And I'll also mention, in terms of disadvantaged communities, we also have ongoing work that'll cross-cut with this on Justice 40 initiatives, where 40% of benefits should go to disadvantaged communities, and we're looking at that right now.
Thank you. You know, having access to high-speed broadband is now becoming a common good because our society is tied into the ability to access high-speed broadband. We can't ask our children to do homework on the internet when our children don't have access to the internet. And we can't ask people to go online to receive essential information, to receive essential services when they don't have access to the internet. It will only exacerbate the disparities that we see in healthcare, in education, in employment, in business development, and we need to end that once and for all. And so I strongly believe that with proper oversight, these programs can help bridge the digital divide and give everyone in our country a real chance to share in our country's prosperity. I believe it's a common good. We should start having conversations about it, as utility companies are a common good. And I'm glad that Congress passed these crucial measures and bills to revisit them now to see the good work they are already doing for the American people. And I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. Now recognize Mr. Duncan for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, this has been in the news, so it's no surprise to anyone, but Congress and the administration are in the process of negotiating raising the nation's debt ceiling. And what that means is the nation has maxed out its credit card, and we've got to go back to the banks and ask them to increase the credit limit. Most banks would ask us to come up with some sort of business plan or model of reforms to show we're going to actually rein in our spending, get a hold of our spending addiction, and show them a plan of repaying the debt. That's what banks do for private businesses that ask for a credit line increase for their business, or us as individuals as we go and get home equity lines and other things. So the nation is $31 trillion plus in debt. That meter's running every day. So, General Donaldson, according to the Department of Energy, the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act authorizes it to administer $8.8 billion in rebates for home energy efficiency and electrification projects. The department's Home Efficient Rebate Program will award grants to state energy offices to provide rebates for energy-saving retrofits and housing structures. Additionally, the department plans to issue grants to states and tribal entities for home electrification and appliance rebates program. In your experience, what concerns should Congress be aware of regarding the rebate programs generally?
In general,
And you can aim that microphone a little closer, that works.
in general, rebate programs are in fact risky. There's a tremendous volume of recipients. It can be difficult to have them properly identified. They could be people who are already deceased. You know, rebate programs are difficult. Grant programs raise some of those same issues. So it's really important, I think, that you combine two things: well thought out internal controls and the use of data analytics, because the volume of rebates moving through some of these programs is going to be staggering. So collect quality data on the front end, scrub it, look at it, check for red flags, take a more modern approach on things such as rebates, and you'll be able to safeguard a higher volume of those funds.
So these grants are given to the state energy offices, and what sort of oversight is there from the federal level of those programs? Because it seems to me like we're just giving the money to the states, allow them to run the programs, and there's not a lot of federal oversight.
There is some concern I co-chair the group of Inspectors General managing IIJA funds. One of our subgroups is state, local, tribal inspectors general. My shop also staffs that group, so we've had a lot of conversations with them. And there is a lot of concern that it is not clear what amount of funds they can use for oversight. They are understaffed. You know, many of the same things we've been talking about here today can be even worse at a state, local, or tribal level. So when the federal government, before the federal government transfers large amounts of money in bulk, it has to ensure that the state, local government, or tribe is ready to receive it and can administer it appropriately, or the losses will only continue to domino outward.
Right. When I hear understaffing, I think that federal government created a problem of understaffing because you gave them all this money and required them to do certain things, and states want to give out the money, I get that, but we created the problem by our funding, and now there's going to have to be increases at the state level or even the federal level to increase the amount of personnel, which means government just continues to grow and the dominoes keep falling. This would apply to the Weatherization Assistance Program. That program received $3.5 billion from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, according to the White House. Do the concerns you highlighted in this special report in your testimony still persist regarding this program?
That's another program where they're staffing up. They have the benefit of our prior recommendations because that was a pre-existing program at the department. So the future will tell, you know, whether or not those funds land where Congress intended.
Yeah, so we're just, through the infrastructure bill, through the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act, we're just growing government and requiring more staffing as government grows to administer programs where the money is given to the state with very little accountability, very little oversight to the state, that the programs will actually work to do the things that the misnamed bills hope to do. So thanks for your clarity on that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back, and now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Kamick, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess we all got the memo on the blue blazers and black shirts today. Mr. Chairman, where'd you go wrong?
I'm a little off today, and some would say today is not an exception.
Well, I appreciate the chairman for hosting this very, very important oversight hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I'm going to start with you, Inspector General Gustafson. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act established the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, under which the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, will distribute $42.45 billion in broadband infrastructure funding to states and certain territories. This program is structured as one big block grant to states, and then the states are responsible for awarding the funds to the entity that will be deploying the broadband in different parts of the state. Given that the NTIA does not have direct control over awarding funds to each grantee, what oversight challenges does that present for the agency in your office, particularly as we're trying to handle overbuilding in certain areas? Wow, this is a big one. Right. Take it away.
So there is no question that we believe that Commerce and Commerce OIG, that our responsibility does not, to your point, end at the block grant level. I mean, we are keenly aware that after the grants are going to be sent to the states based on the FCC maps, the funds are still supposed to be used. They don't lose their intended purpose. They're supposed to be used for that. And it is I will say, it is a tremendous challenge in that all of a sudden you aren't talking about the conversations that we can have with NTIA. You're talking about innumerable state and local entities for a staff of, 2 teams, and even our total staff is under 200. So there are absolute challenges. What we have communicated to the department is that we want them, we want to be part of the outreach that is happening as the program is being rolled out. I mean, we want the state auditors and the local entities to know that the OIG is here, that Commerce is here, that there are still, that we are keenly interested in overseeing and being told and hearing about issues that are coming up. Because to your point, the issues on a block grant don't happen at that level. They happen 2, 3, 4 steps down. And so we will do our level best, you know, to get that word out, but it's going to be a challenge because we are all of a sudden talking about hundreds of projects, probably thousands of projects.
I understand this is a gargantuan one, but I mean, $42 billion, we're gonna have to do better than our level best for sure, and I recognize that we're dealing with all the different states. And this actually follows right into my second question, where NTIA was recently directed by Congress to establish 6 new broadband programs over the last 3 years. Some of these programs have similar goals, but they have different statutory requirements, different funding levels, different timelines, et cetera. So have you guys had any discussions with NTIA before they established the programs to discuss how integrity was going to be accounted for, and also to reduce the likelihood of fraud in these programs?
We have had conversations with NTIA. We have made it clear that while we cannot give our stamp of approval on what they're doing, we stand ready to talk about lessons learned and things that we would like to see as the oversight entity, you know, things that we would like to see in the notices of funding opportunities that will allow the transparency needed to follow the money. So I think that, you know, those conversations have occurred. To your point, NTIA has not been in the business of broadband grants for a while, so they're having to kind of almost start over because BTOP was under ARA, it was many, many years ago. So there are grant-making entities within Department of Commerce. NOAA makes a lot of grants, NIST makes a lot of grants. So we've also emphasized the importance of it not being just an NTIA job, that there be conversations and working together with the other grant-making entities within Department of Commerce to make sure that those controls are being placed in. So the conversations are happening, but our work, of course, will really begin in earnest when the money.
Can you proactively, and are you proactively reaching out to states as we're dealing with these block grants to talk about what requirements are going to be happening or coming out? That way they can be compliant on the front end rather than catching up on the back end?
We are absolutely being proactive. I know other IGs involved in IIJR as well, and often it's a joint effort where we're appearing together sometimes at state and local auditors conferences, at meetings. So we are, and for my office, and it's often a representative not just from audit, but from the investigative side, from the Office of Investigations, to talk about what the fraud indicators are, what the people should be looking for that might indicate that there's a problem. So we are having those discussions right now. And the nice thing about the IIJA working group is sometimes it's Department of Transportation who is out there, but you know, I know that Mr. Soskin, is actually talking about the programs in general, so that again, that level of awareness is happening. Because to your point, a lot of people don't know what an OIG is, you know, unless you're here. So it really is important to get that word out. And I say that as somebody who worked in a state auditor's office for 8 years, and we knew that GAO existed, but didn't really know about OIG. So it's important to have those proactive conversations.
Well, excellent. I know my time has expired. I'm way over, but I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady, and seeing that there are no further members wishing to ask questions today, I would like to thank all of our witnesses again for being here today. You've been very informative and energetic.
Thank you all very much.
And in pursuit of the